The objectives of tonight's webinars are to expand the understanding of managing diversity and relationship dynamics, explore options for responding more effectively to diversity tension, and devise solutions for enhancing cultural competency in the workplace. NHSC is pleased to offer continuing education units and continuing medical education credits of 1.5 hours for all disciplines participating in this webinar. To receive these hours, you must attend the full 1.5-hour session. Throughout the webinar, you will be required to respond to online poll questions to verify your attendance. Once you respond to all polls, your attendance will be noted. At the conclusion of the presentation, the operator will provide instructions on how to submit a question through the conference bridge line. There will also be an evaluation after the question and answer session. We would appreciate it if you took a few minutes to fill it out so we can continue to improve our future sessions. Thank you again for joining the 2012 NHSC webinar series. We hope you find this webinar useful in your daily efforts to provide service in your community. Now please welcome Daryl Butler.
Well, thank you, Barbara. Hope everyone is doing well. And welcome to our conference, to our webinar, I should say. I'm going tonight to talk about, as Barbara mentioned, a little thing that I like to call diversity tension. And if you kind of don't know what that means or what that is, allow me to shed a little bit of light on it in terms of put some context around it. It's that feeling of uneasiness that you get because someone that you work with may like to do things a little bit differently from the way you like to do things, or maybe it's a patient or someone that you're caring for that is rubbing you the wrong way every now and then. That one patient that maybe they walk in and like, oh my goodness, not today. And that feeling of tension can come about from a variety of differences, I should say. So that's what we're going to really focus our conversation around today, around this evening, is what is cultural competence? And I know the word is used a lot, the term is used a lot, so we're going to put a nice definition around it that helps everyone to understand what does that thing mean called cultural competence. Or what are some of the challenges associated with cultural competence? What is that? How are my challenged? How are organizations even challenged? And as we are trying to overcome some of those challenges that inevitably comes with diversity and inclusion, what is my own individual role in creating these challenging situations, and of course then in resolving these difficult, challenging relationships and situations in the workplace context. So we'll try to keep our conversation to the workplace, to your experience of being healthcare providers. But as you'll find out, a lot of the tips and tools that we're going to talk about today, you're probably going to find out is helpful in your personal lives as well. And I may even give some examples from both perspectives to kind of hit home a bit. So let's first and foremost get right into defining what we mean by cultural competence. Like I said, I know the term is used a lot, and there are multiple definitions out there, in fact, on what cultural competence is. What we're going to do is we're going to define it in really two broad perspectives and then break it down into some subcomponents of those perspectives. The first part of cultural competence from our perspective in the innovations, our organization innovations, is that it's about cultural competence is about meeting people where they are. You may have heard this term before, but what that really means is becoming knowledgeable, acceptable, and adaptable of differences. It doesn't mean that I have to know everything there is to know about every difference or every culture that's out there. Being knowledgeable simply says I'm kind of in a continuous learning process. Acceptable simply says that even when I am experiencing differences that either I'm not aware of or differences that do make me uneasy, I'm moving myself to some level of acceptance. And in the workplace context, I think that's very important, because there may be a difference that someone is exhibiting, that might make you uneasy. However, you've still got to meet the objective of providing great patient care. And it's a matter of overcoming that moment of uneasiness so that you can accept what they're bringing to the table, meet them where they are, and meet the objective that you're there to meet. And that's where the adaptable comes in as well, flexing sometimes our own style, not necessarily changing who we are, but simply flexing our style to meet someone else where they are. That's what we mean by meeting them where they are. And just a kind of a broad example of that is I am by nature very task oriented, but it turns out that I end up working with a number of relationship oriented people. I guess that's just the universe's way of testing my diversity and inclusion skill set. So with that in mind, I like to, get right to the task at hand, and some of my relationship-oriented colleagues would prefer to open up the meeting, open up our time together with a conversation about, what happened over the weekend. As a task-oriented person, my perspective is the weekend is done, that task is over, let's move on to today. But I get that, and that they may want to have that conversation just to kind of put the moment at ease. So I flex my style a little bit and prepare for that in fact, and engage in that conversation without looking at my watch as to say, are we done yet? So that's a little bit about what we mean by meet them where they are, and that's really showing ultimately some cultural humility, I would call it. And then the other component of cultural competence is really understanding how you show up. And how you, where's that? How you show up has two components in and of itself. How you show up in terms of the impact of your behaviors on others. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. And another thing we'll talk about in this conversation this evening is and how we respond to diversity tension. So again, cultural competence, meeting people where they are. That's about them, and knowing how you show up, that's about you. So having some cultural humility towards others and truly understanding you in terms of how you're showing up at the table. So now when we're talking about cultural competency and where does this fit, the differences that we're talking about, they're really, a lot of ways in which we might be similar or different for that matter. And so in this conversation, we like to identify or at least put some context around the various ways in which we might feel different. The various ways in which we might feel different might be different, not feel different, but show up differently. Long list, but one of the things we do is we put the list into some categories. The first category that we like to use is something we call primary differences. You might see other terms for these particular differences, but primary differences are represented by things like age, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or physical abilities. And if you look at that list there, the first thing that you might notice is that it is a list of differences that, for the most part, we don't have a lot of choice over. 18 was a great age. It was a long time ago, and as much as I try to show up as an 18-year-old or again, by choices, that's not going to happen. Someone's going to call me out. So, again, we don't have a lot of choice over these. These are kind of the ways in which we are. It is what it is. Another commonality about the primary differences is that we have laws around these. Laws that say we're not to discriminate around these. We have federal laws of anti-discrimination around these particular differences with all except sexual orientation. There are some individual states that have state laws around sexual orientation discrimination, but there's no federal law as of yet. So those are some things, and if you look at that list, everyone in your organization, everyone that you work with, everyone that's on this call, in fact, first and foremost, we're all included in the conversation of inclusion and cultural competence. Just looking at this first list of differences. So we all get to become part of the conversation of diversity, so to speak, simply by the primary differences. But there are some ways in which we add breadth and depth to who we are. Those primary differences don't make up all of who we are, and so we look at some additional ways, things that we may not necessarily see when we walk into the room, like many of the primary differences, but nevertheless they're part of who we are, and that makes up what we call secondary dimensions of diversity. Things like religion, spirituality, language, geography, where you live, family status, what I call marital or parental status. I just roll it up into family status, appearance, physical, educational level, work style, personal habits. All these things add breadth and depth to who we are, and we may not again necessarily see them when we walk into the room, but they're part of our makeup. And then there's another segment of our differences, especially in the context of our work experiences. And that's something we call organizational diversity. Sometimes we may call it systems diversity. It's really about how we are functioning and operating inside of the organizations in which we operate. Either different departments, or my role in the organization, the function that I have. If there are unions, union environments typically will, we see some differences there. Seniority in the workplace, work experience, different locations. Sometimes if there is a satellite office, a satellite site for the main hospital, as an example, there may be some diversity challenges or tension going on between those different sites or different departments or different functions within a hospital or clinic setting, just as an example. So the reason why we really like to get a broader understanding of what we mean by differences that impact in cultural competence is, when we look at this list of differences, they have ways in which they impact us in many different aspects of our lives. Sometimes we like to use the term core identity, the ways in which I show up, the ways in which I see myself I see the world through my lenses, so to speak. And so what I like for you to do is to think about looking at this list. What are some of these differences that represent how you identify yourself? And I'm gonna draw a circle around a couple of the ones that represent what I like to call my core identity. So one of my core identities is race. Another one, I'll go ahead and I'll combine marital status and parental status, and I'll just call that family status. And another one of my core identities is, well, we'll call it personal habits. We'll fit into personal habits. So let me give you a couple of examples. In terms of race, for me, major core identity for me, I'm an African American male. When I worked in corporate America in the pharmaceutical industry, I have multiple examples in which I showed up in marketing meetings, providing a perspective of my life as an African American male. I remember we talked when we were launching our osteoporosis drug, as an example, and the conversation from the marketing department was they weren't going to focus efforts on African American women, because African American women just didn't have osteoporosis at high numbers as compared to Caucasian and Asian women. And I remember having a conversation with one of my representatives at the time, who was African American as well, and we started sharing different people in her family in particular that had osteoporosis, African American women. And so we said, well, that sounds like a different story from what we were told in the launch meeting. So we started, we said, well, let's put on our lenses through our experience of being African American and see if we can have a different conversation, a different story to tell our physicians that we're calling on. And surely enough, the data that we discovered was that osteoporosis, being the rate of bone loss, the rate of bone loss does occur with African American women. at a similar rate. The difference typically is that African American women may have a longer, may have a higher bone density to begin with, and so that was a different story to have to go in and into a call for on a physician and share. I mean, it was, one story would have been, oh, doctor, the African American women in your patient population, don't worry about them and osteoporosis, so don't worry about this particular drug. Another story that we came up with was, did you know that the rate of bone loss does occur in African American women, even though they start off with a higher bone density? So it's worthy of checking to make sure that that rate of bone loss is not impacting them with the end result of osteoporosis. Two different stories came up because we showed up with our core identity and put those lenses of being African American in the business setting on that business decision and got different outcomes. So that's just one example of how, in fact, regardless of what others might think, our own individual core identities will have an impact or can have an impact on our work experiences. Now, that's one example. Again, what if you have a piece of paper, if you've already downloaded the handout, you'll see a section there that give you an opportunity to write down or circle even some of the differences that represent your own core identity. I think it's a great exercise just to kind of get a feel and understanding of how you are showing up in the lenses that you're using. So if core identities are, I would say, the things that make me tick, so to speak. There's another way in which we like to use this list, and that is to help us understand the differences that are creating a little bit of tension for us on a regular basis. We call those tension dimensions. And with tension dimensions, I'm going to show, let me see here, I'm going to change my color and I'm going to do a check mark for a few tension dimensions of mine. Let's see, tension dimension 1 is personal habit. That's that was a little raggedy there. There we go. So personal habits, tension dimension, one of them that's not on here probably is it's not on here, but smoker, non-smoker, that's a big one for me. And I would say geographic, but part of that is just the travel piece for me. Now, personal habits. Why is that a tension dimension for me? Just showing you an example, and then you can identify your own tension dimensions. Tension dimension, maybe personal habit, as you notice, is also one of my core identities. And then the part of my life I'm talking about there is my vegan diet. I'm a vegan by diet, not by lifestyle, but by diet. And at least three times a day, I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to eat and where I'm going to go. And then when it comes to eating with colleagues, if we're going to have a staff meeting together or dinner meeting or what have you, I'm bringing that